Welcome, Commissioner. Nice to see you again. And this time, although last time, this time on Canada's emissions reduction policies, which the topic you've broached a number of times. And
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Yes, Mr. Mazier.
I just wondered if we had any intentions of the minister coming on SUPS at all.
I haven't had a confirmation. We did invite him for, it was the 4th. He couldn't attend, which is why we did the Net Zero Accelerator. That's a good question you raised about the SUPS, because I believe as of Tuesday, hopefully the estimates will have been adopted, and I don't know if so it becomes a moot point. Looking at the SUPS becomes a moot point for us, because they will have basically been adopted by the House, hopefully.
Well, anything, the better understanding we have of what the government's spending.
Yeah, well, you're saying you want the minister back.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
yeah. I'll check with his staff, and we'll see what happens. Okay. Commissioner, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chair, we are happy to appear before your committee this morning. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. With me today are Kimberly Leach and Elsa Da Costa, the principal and the director, who have conducted much of the audit work on climate change that we have undertaken in recent years. Since 1990, Canada has set out many plans, measures, and targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but no target has been met. According to Environment and Climate Change Canada, national emissions in 2022 were 708 megatons. This is 7% lower than in 2005, but 16% higher than in 1990. According to the department's most recent projections, with existing measures, Canada will not deliver on its commitment to reduce emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. While Canada's overall emissions have increased since 1990, some sectors have achieved reductions, with the electricity sector leading the pack. The good news is that there is still time to meet the 2030 target, but it will not happen without a significant shift toward implementing effective actions. The time is now to take stock of existing policies and plans and to consider lessons learned from past efforts. In November 2021, I provided to Parliament a report that sets out 8 lessons learned from Canada's record on climate change. The report is based on 3 decades of audits focused on Canada's action and inaction on the enduring climate crisis. Given Canada's disappointing track record in addressing climate change, we urge the government to ensure that its plans and actions work to meet its targets. At the time of our 2021 report, we noted that implementing the measures then in place was expected to yield reductions of 36% by 2030. To help frame discussions on climate change such as this one, the Lessons Learned report also sets out critical questions for parliamentarians to consider as levers to prompt action against commitments. We have provided these in appendix to this statement for your reference. Le premier rapport d'environnement.
Environment and Climate Change Canada's first progress report under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, issued in 2023, shows that the gap between anticipated results from current measures and meeting the 2030 target persists. This legislation, if implemented diligently, should help establish the accountability and oversight needed to reduce emissions and meet targets. Since 2021, our office has examined about 40 of the more than 140 measures identified in the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan or its progress report. Our most recent report on this topic, tabled last month, highlighted 6 common themes from our findings, such as delays in the implementation of measures, unreliable estimates of emission reductions, and a lack of transparency. In our audit work, we have noted that many experts and international bodies agree that a policy package with a range of measures, such as regulations and carbon pricing, can support deep emission reductions if they are stringent enough and applied widely. The enduring crisis of climate change looms larger than ever. We are at a crossroads, both globally and nationally, and we face difficult decisions on how we deal with the changing climate and what kind of world that we want to leave to future generations. It is clear that new or enhanced measures are needed to put Canada on track to meet its 2030 emission reduction target. In this context, on track means 3 things. First, there needs to be a plan with concrete measures that add up to meeting or exceeding the target. Second, there needs to be reliable modeling of the reductions the plan is expected to deliver. And third, there needs to be an effective implementation of actions resulting in significant year-over-year reductions.
My opening remarks. We are happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Commissioner, we'll go dive right into questions, and it's Mr. Mazur who's up first.
Thank you, Chair, and nice to see you again here, Commissioner, and others. Commissioner, last week the Industry Department testified on the government's $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund. Was there anything the department said that concerned you?
Yes, there was.
Elaborate?
I'm used to you starting with yes or no good questions, so I was prepared this time.
Go on, great.
So, yeah, to start off with, as you recall, our report indicated that they had just over 6 megatons of bankable reductions in the contribution agreements. Yet last week, the department assured that they were on track to meeting the Environment and Climate Change Canada's hoped for emissions of 19 to 20. I would have liked to have heard where those other reductions were coming from, by which facility, by which date, and how confident they were, because that's a big gap between 6 and 19 or 20. It's easy to assert that one is on track, but I'd like to see the evidence for that. And we didn't see the evidence for that when we did our audit.
Commissioner, the government is refusing to tell Canadians what the emission reduction target is for the $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund. Have you ever seen an emission reduction target protected under cabinet confidence before?
I believe there's been that example, and there was also the oil and gas percentage in our first Net Zero Act report from November of last year. That was also the subject of some questioning at a committee regarding the cabinet confidence behind the, I think it was a 31% figure in that report. So those are 2 examples.
It is problematic.
Most certainly, because from a transparency and accountability point of view, these measures cost taxpayers or cost industry or cost government considerable sums to implement. So we would like to see at least an estimation of essentially the value for money in these various measures. And one necessary element of calculating value for money is to know how many reductions are expected.
Yeah, for $8 billion, like if you don't know what the target is, it's pretty hard to hit it, right? So you can change the rules as you go along. The government gave a company by the name of PowerCo $700 million through their Net Zero Accelerator Fund. The government claimed that the Net Zero Accelerator Fund was needed to reduce emissions. However, the Industry Department could not tell this committee how many emissions, if any, were reduced by this $700 million handout. So do you view this as problematic?
Our concerns about accurate estimations of emissions reductions primarily fall within those grants and contributions related to Pillar 1 of the 3 pillars of the Net Zero Accelerator. But having said that, if that amount of money is going out the door, there should be some estimation of the benefits. Whether they can make a concrete estimation of exact greenhouse gas emission reductions, perhaps not, but there should be at least some evaluation and publication for Canadians of the value that is going to be reaped from that subsidy, rather than just a just trust us sort of approach.
Yeah. And we know how just trust us works, right? Commissioner, the Environment Committee ordered the government to hand over all contracts for their $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund. However, the government ripped out over 360 pages out of those documents. This prevented our committee from seeing what the $8 billion was spent on. You've seen the contracts. Do you see any reason or believe why the government would actually be hiding this information from this parliamentary committee?
Well, I'm more familiar with our free access provisions in our legislation, and so we're able to see those documents. I'm not an expert in the rights and privileges that committees and the House or the Senate have in terms of access to documents. So you would have to consult with the committee clerk and counsel on that. But I do have a concern in general regarding that amount of money going out the door without enough either disclosure of the documents or at least disclosure of the benefits that are going to arise from those documents. If there are trade secrets within the documents or other confidential information, I understand that. But there should at least be transparency in what the expected outcomes are. And if that can be quantified, especially under Pillar 1 of the Net Zero Accelerator, in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, all the better.
But there was definitely information in there, like to rip out 360 pages. Like, is there any information they should be hiding in there? And I think you explained that, like intellectual property, things like that are sensitive. But meanwhile, what is the $8 billion doing, and how is it reducing emissions? Is obviously that's it's pretty narrow scope, and you should be able to show some kind of benefit for that, right?
Well, we're going to go to Ms. Taylor-Roy now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. DeMarco, for being here, and Ms. DaCosta, and Ms. Leach as well. I actually read through some of the lessons learned that you had put in here and things we should be asking about, and I'm actually going to ask you, because you've done so much work on this, I actually want to ask back to you some of the questions that you posed to the government, because I think you may have some answers and some ideas in some of this. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was Lesson 2. You started by saying that there's been no government since 1990 that has met their targets for emissions reductions. So that's governments, obviously from both parties, over time have failed to do this. And it seems now that one of the reasons is, when we look at it, is something you point out, is that we have our economy is dependent on emissions-intensive industries and sectors, such as oil and gas. And in this, you talk about, what we can do to deliver on its promise, for this oil and gas sector to actually meet the targets. And you talked about the levers as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the cap on pollution that we've put in place from the oil and gas industry. Now, the oil and gas industry has its own targets set, and this cap is basically just enforcing that, ensuring that they will meet those targets. But there's a lot of controversy about putting this in place, the cap on pollution. Is this the kind of lever you're talking about that we need, or something like this, or what else would you suggest to ensure that the oil and gas sector actually follow through on its commitments to reduce emissions?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So lesson 2 is in from our 2021 report is Canada's economy is still dependent on emissions-intensive sectors. And then we pose several questions for parliamentarians to consider. So as I've indicated to this committee in prior appearances, because over half of all emissions in Canada are from just 2 sectors, oil and gas and transportation, Canada needs to get a handle on those sectors. It's a choice for government and for parliamentarians to the extent that some measures are set out in legislation to determine which measures to use. But the fact remains that all sectors need to abate their emissions to meet the target, especially oil and gas because it's the largest one, accounting for over 30%. The oil and gas emissions cap is the current choice by the current government. And whatever the measure is, there does need to be something to bring that curve down from the oil and gas industry, just like electricity, as I mentioned in my opening statement, has been able to do, even with an increase in production over the last 30 years.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, the oil and gas sector is the only sector that's increased. We've seen a 7% decrease since 2005. But the oil and gas sector continue to increase. So do you think this lever, a cap on pollution, enforcing what they have said they're going to do, will be effective, that will help the oil and gas sector actually meet its emissions targets?
Well, it's only a draft regulation at this stage, and it just the accompanying explanation for it was just released a couple of weeks ago. So obviously, we haven't audited that measure. We've audited about 40 measures, but we wait till they're actually measures as opposed to just hoped-for measures. So I can't say anything about my view on the efficacy of that particular measure, but I do agree with the proposition that if Canada has a total emissions reduction target, it needs to get a handle on the largest sector's emissions in order for it to add up to the total.
Great. Yeah, and we saw transportation is coming down, so, and as you say, electricity, which is fantastic. Next thing I wanted to turn to is the Canadian Climate Institute. We've also heard a lot about, the measures aren't working because we're not seeing emissions drop quickly enough. And the Canadian Climate Institute said that the impact of policies will increase over time. Some will only have been in effect for a few years, and others will increase in stringency after 2030. The zero-emission vehicle standards are a good example, but they give other ones. Now, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, you mentioned we should have qualitative, at least, descriptions of how they will reduce if we can't have specific quantitative ones. And we know that the department only felt comfortable asking for those when they were meeting our 2030, not our 2050 goals. So do you agree that a lot of these policies and a lot of these investments we're making right now, we're not going to see the benefits by 2030? We're going to see them longer term, for example, between 2030 and 2050?
If the benefits are realized, then yes, many of them are longer term. Same conclusion would be reached with our analysis of the 2 Billion Trees program, which we did a couple of years ago. So it's actually not a bad thing to be looking far out. In fact, lesson 8 from that same report that we just talked about talks about taking a long-term perspective. The longer the perspective, the harder it is to be specific about the reductions associated with it. But there can still be some transparency as to the anticipated benefits, even if they aren't going to be credibly estimated to the level that you could actually call them bankable reductions.
Thank you. And I think in the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, the documents I looked through, all the contracts, there was that qualitative kind of saying how it would happen. It just wasn't specific amounts. But the last thing I wanted to go to was lesson 4. So we did 2, 8, now 4 on our risk of falling behind other countries on investing in a climate resilient future. And we've just finished a study on sustainable finance. We're trying to get to the report to get that out, and actually a colleague who's not here today, Madame Posey, had suggested a letter to try and expedite that. But is that the government's work on sustainable finance and getting in place the taxonomy and some of the reporting requirements, do you think that's going to be helpful for us in terms of getting more investments into
unfortunately,
the climate resilient future?
You'll have to give the answer in response to someone else when you have a chance. I'm sorry about that. Monsieur Fortin, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Fortin, you have the floor. How much time do I have? 6 minutes. Mr. DeMarco, welcome. I'm very pleased to see you here today. I myself am new, so you definitely have more experience than I do, because this is my first time here. I'm replacing my colleague, Ms. Posey, who would have been much better at putting her questions to you, so please be patient with me. But I am going to try and ask you a few questions. First, in your report, number 7, you state that no new significant federal measures have been taken since the 2022 projections. So from what I understand, not only were the targets not met, but it'll be hard to see any of the targets being met within a reasonable time frame. Do you think the government should be implementing new measures in order to meet its reduction targets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Or do you feel that the current measures are sufficient but not being applied stringently enough? So new measures or not? Well, yes, new measures are required because there is a gap between the 36% and the minimum of 40%. So either they have to improve the measures that are in place, or they need to add new ones. In that case, what do you think should be added in the way of measures? What more should we be doing? Well, that's a policy choice, and it's a choice that the government must make. But we, in 2021, on Lessons Learned, reported that there was this 4% gap. That is to say, 4 points between 36 and 40%. And I am disappointed to see that 3 years later, we're putting the same sentence in our report, and that is that, once again, there is this shortfall of 4%. So they do need new measures in order to be able to meet those targets. Then just allow me to repeat what's on my mind. You are the expert on these issues. You know how things unfold. I realize that you are a neutral body, but you do look at these issues in depth. So what I would like to know is, in your opinion, what new measures have to be taken if we really are committed to achieving the targets that were set? Well, what is required is, of our part, is to remain within our mandates. So we assess measures in place and their performance in terms of value for money, and we look at the government's performance. On the other hand, the choice of measures and policies really falls to the government. And under the Act, it is up to us to provide, or rather there is another group that is supposed to provide advice in terms of policies. And you could invite them to come here if you wanted to. Well, that's probably a good idea, but I won't necessarily be here. What do you think is responsible for actually slowing down implementing these measures? Well, we identified a few of them in this year's report, as well as the 2023 report. So one example would be this. There are negotiations with the provinces, and that is a factor. There are many issues related to that, and many environmental and sustainable development issues. And it's a shared jurisdiction between the provinces and the federal government. So that is one of the factors that can be responsible for slowing down the work of the federal government. because there isn't necessarily consensus on many of these measures. So that is a factor when it comes to implementing them, because there are provinces that may disagree with one measure. There may be others that do agree with one of those measures. And the federal government attempts to reach a consensus, but oftentimes it's simply not possible. And so it takes time before a decision is reached when there isn't a consensus. In your opinion, is that the only reason for the slow implementation or the difficulty in agreeing between provinces and the federal government? Or are there other factors that affect this, the pace? Well, I gave that as one example. It's not the only reason. I believe in paragraph 11, we note we provide a summary of the various criteria that were used in order to assess these measures. Thank you very much. Thank you. There are other reasons, yes, I understand, but we're now going to move on to Ms. Collins.
Well, maybe I'll pick up where Mr. Fortin ended, just a little bit more about either of these underutilized strategies that could help us reduce our emissions faster, but also the stringency of the regulations and policies that we have now. Can you talk a little bit about which policies need to be more stringent, and from my perspective, one of the big reasons that the stringency hasn't been as strong as it needs to be is because of the influence of oil and gas. And curious if you can speak at all to the kind of political influence and lobbying influence of that sector and how it has an impact on these policies.
So in order to bridge the gap between Environment and Climate Change Canada's current estimation of 36% reductions from existing measures and 40%, which is the minimum, they could either add measures, as I indicated earlier, or strengthen measures, or a combination of both. But certainly the bankable measures that are in place now are not sufficient. And I should add, as I did in an earlier appearance before this committee, that 36% estimation is from Environment and Climate Change Canada. We believe that a truer number would be lower than that because of some overly optimistic assumptions that are brought into that 36%. But regardless of whether it's 36%,
could you just remind the committee? Could you remind the committee what your estimation is? That lower estimation?
Yeah. So we haven't done a competing number. We just have indicated qualitatively that we believe that it's something lower than 36% because of the various overestimations and double counting that we've uncovered. But we haven't gone through all 140 plus measures. We've only gone through about 40. So we haven't been able to give a competing number to the 36%, but it is something lower than 36%. That's the best I can do.
Wonderful. Is there any plans to go through all of those policies and provide that kind of number in the future?
It's something under consideration. And as I've indicated before, I'd be more inclined to consider that if they had a plan that on paper added up to what is necessary to meet the target. And that would lend itself to an analysis to see whether that actually does add up when you peel back the layers and so on. But until such time as they actually have a plan that meets 40 to 45%, it's not necessarily a great use of resources to indicate that it's an exact number below 36% because we still just need the gap to be filled first. So it's something I'll consider. I had hoped to be in a position to do that earlier because it was in 2021 that our report said that they were at 36% and needed to get to 40, and here we are 3 years later, and we have almost the same sentence in our report.
We haven't bridged the gap.
Yeah.
And when it comes to increasing the stringency on some of these key policies, we've been pushing for increased stringency on the emissions cap, on the output-based pricing system. Can you name a few of the ones that you think need to be strengthened, and that stringency needs to be enhanced. And then, if possible, touch on that piece around the influence of the oil and gas sector on these policies and their lack of stringency.
Yeah, so one example would be from our report on carbon pricing, where we identified some weaknesses in the essentially the fairness between the industrial price and the retail or consumer price, especially as regards to small businesses and Indigenous peoples. Those are the examples we gave there. So an increased stringency on the industrial side of the carbon pricing may have an important impact. That's one example. But again, it's a choice for government to make as to whether they want to increase the stringency. So that's one example. And then, of course, regulations are another example where stringency can be increased and essentially ambition be ratcheted up as experience is gained with the application of regulations. So both carbon pricing and regulations, they're both areas where stringency could be included if that's the will of the government.
Wonderful. And then,
Sorry. Yeah.
what? Yeah, when big oil and gas CEOs came to our committee to testify last spring, they told the members here and Canadians that the emissions cap wasn't necessary because they already had their own emissions reduction targets that were set. I will note that those targets are not legally binding. In your mind, is there any evidence that these big companies like Suncor, Imperial Oil, Shell Canada, and others would reduce their emissions without stringent regulations like the emissions cap?
So it's technically possible for that to happen through voluntary measures, but the track record, and I'm looking down at the graph of greenhouse gas emissions by sector from 1990 to now, which I can provide the committee after this hearing. Experience to date has been that even if oil and gas, the sector has increased its efficiency with which it pollutes, essentially emissions intensity improvements, those benefits have been outweighed by larger increases in production. So something is going to be needed to change that curve to mirror perhaps more the electricity curve or some of the other curves that are at least flat, or if not decreasing. So something is needed to get a handle on oil and gas, yes.
Thank you. Monsieur Deltel pour 5 minutes.
Mr. Deltel, 5 minutes. Welcome, and welcome to Mr. Fortin, who is here for the first time. It's a pleasure to have him, and it's also a pleasure to see you here today, Commissioner. Now, we all know that pollution and emissions have to be reduced, and there are tools there at great cost to taxpayers, but we do need to see results. So I'd like to talk about the Net Zero Accountability Plan. Under that plan, it's clear that this is taxpayers' money that is being used to accelerate the process, but we all need to know what that is and what the targets are that we need to achieve. This is $8 billion worth of taxpayers' money, and we're not talking about tax. We know that it's not the tax itself. We're talking about Canadians' money, taxpayers' money, $8 billion. Now, what do you think about what we have heard here in the committee? What do you think about how efficient the government has been in achieving its targets thanks to the $8 billion in this accountability plan? Well, as I said a week ago, we have various concerns regarding the accountability plan, and one of those concerns is the lack of transparency in terms of value of money. Also, there have only been 5 agreements with companies in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions targets, or rather there's been a lack of agreement. So we also have concerns with a horizontal policy within the industry. And so I do have several concerns regarding this type of subsidy. Let's take another example. That's the $700 million that the government gave to a foreign firm to establish a plant in Ontario. It was very surprising, and it was in the reports that we had access to, because some reports are public. So $700 million worth of taxpayers' money in order to accelerate reaching our targets by 2050. However, the $700 million and no targets. Well, it's not up to me to explain that. It's the minister who's responsible for explaining how they are obtaining value for money and value for taxpayers' money. And they have to explain that to parliamentarians and to taxpayers. We expressed the same concerns in our report that you have raised. In other words, that there's a lack of transparency in terms of the results that they are attempting to achieve under that subsidy, because these are very significant sums of money. These aren't just small. It's not a small amount. We're talking about $8 billion. Then how can we convince people that this is so important if we're not even able to be transparent, and on top of that, that we're not even reaching our targets? How do you manage to convince people that it's important? Well, that is something I spoke about 2 years ago. If there's an improvement in transparency, then that is good for parliamentary officers like ourselves, because we emphasize transparency, and including in meetings like this, in our committee this morning. What it also does is it shows people how their money is being used and that it's being used efficiently. And if they trust the process, then they'll know that it's worthwhile to try and tackle pollution with these measures. So that is the advantage in being transparent. You can say to taxpayers, yes, we are using your money for this, but we're using it efficiently, and it's showing results. As you know, we've had access to some documents, but 360 pages were redacted, so we couldn't read anything. So let's just be clear. There's technology, there are trade secrets. We understand that. But 360 redacted pages, and when none of the targets have been reached, targets that were set by the government and that require taxpayers' money, now you had access to that. Do you think there is any information in there that doesn't necessarily jeopardize any of the trade secrets, but do you think that there's any information in there that would assist us in how the taxpayers' money is being used? I'm afraid you'll have to answer yes or no, because that's the only time you have left before we move on to Ms. Châtel. If you prefer not to answer now and provide a more fulsome answer later, that's fine. It's up to you. Well, we don't have the version that the committee has, so I can't necessarily speak to that. Thank you. Ms. Châtel. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. Welcome again. We're always pleased to have you before this committee. There was a recent analysis on the part of the Climate Change Institute, and in that analysis, it says that carbon pricing for industries is the biggest driver of greenhouse gas reductions. 300 economists supported this measure as being the most efficient and the least invasive. The Conservative members in Quebec obviously repeat what their leader has said. That is to say, they want to abolish carbon pricing. But what I want to know is if carbon pricing was abolished at a federal government, what impact would that have on Quebec's greenhouse gas emissions targets? Because they actually have a carbon market, and they have one that they share with California. So would that penalize Quebec, because it would become actually responsible for all those emissions targets reductions? Well, we don't necessarily know what measures would replace that measure, so we don't know what it would be. It's very difficult then to comment on giving you any sort of conclusive answer, because we don't know. We're not familiar with the theory underlying this. So I can't necessarily say. I don't know if there would be a negative effect on Quebec or on British Columbia or on California, for example, who have this carbon market like Quebec does. However, what I have said previously is that there already is this gap between 36% and 40%. And if one measure is taken out of the picture, and if that measure is responsible for a large part of the reductions, then we need something as significant as that to replace that measure. I agree. Our Conservative colleagues want to eliminate federal carbon pricing. But it doesn't necessarily apply to Quebec. But what it means is that Quebec would be the only one responsible for tackling climate change here. And no other plan is being brought forward. So those 300 Canadian economists said that carbon pricing is the best way to achieve the target. So to your knowledge, are there any other measures that could be taken instead of that without necessarily increasing a huge deficit? Are there any other measures that are just as efficient? Well, there are tools that are available. There's carbon pricing, there are regulations, subsidies, and there are things like education, for example, and government procurement. A large part of the reductions in the plan depend on pricing, carbon pricing, and regulations. So if one of those measures like carbon pricing is taken out, but one that's just as efficient replaces it, for example, a regulation, then it might be possible to make up for it. But you can't necessarily just change the track and maintain progress, because what you do need to do is create a new system. And what that means is that you'll be starting all over again. You can't just suddenly shift the track you're on. So I'm speaking about alternatives. Either you decide to not do anything for climate change. All you want to do is take out carbon pricing and nothing else is done. And in that case, Canada's emissions rise, but Quebec is alone in making any effort toward reducing them. Or you replace that measure, but then you end up replacing regulations. And so then you're telling people you no longer have the right to emit certain levels. And those are very prescriptive regulations. Or you take new measures and that increases a deficit or leads to a greater deficit. So can you speak to that, please? Well, in terms of grants, it's very costly. And we have seen within our recent reports that there isn't a major impact thanks to any grants in place. So it will be very costly to do that. In terms of regulations that you say are prescriptive, or in other words, that are more command and control type, I'm sorry, we have to stop with that. Unfortunately, Mr. Fortin. How much time do I have? 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. DeMarco, Ms. Chatel's questions are very relevant, and I'd like to follow up on them, but I only have 2.5 minutes. So perhaps we can come back to this at a later date. I want to ask you how the current pricing system in Canada compares with what's happening, for example, in other countries, in the other G20 countries. Well, Canada has a national pricing system. Either the federal system applies or there's a province or territory that has a pricing system. But there is one in each area of the country. And they are similar to Europe's system. However, they have a cap and trade system, but that's also carbon pricing. It's just another tool that they use Yes, but I'm sorry, I don't mean to be impolite. But in terms of efficiency, do you feel that Canada's system is more efficient than the one in place in Europe, or less, or are there other areas in the world that we should maybe use as a model for our own system? Well, once again, you're asking me to make a choice of policy between the policies and the options available. What I can say is this. In other G7 countries, I haven't looked at all the G20 countries, but in the G7 countries, or amongst the G7 countries rather, we really have the worst curb in terms of emissions reductions, and that's going back to 1990 up to today. Carbon pricing is rather recent. Chair, I would like to give, if I'd like to say that I'd like to give my time to Mr. Morris. Well, you can do that, but he only has 30 seconds less. Do you want to do that? Would you like? You're telling me I have 30 seconds left. I'm happy to give that to Mr. Morris if you'd like them. Okay, go ahead for 30 seconds then.
Forte. Commissioner, as you note in one of your recent reports, Canada is now the only country whose emissions have gone up from 1990 levels among G7 peers. Of course, our target doesn't look back to 1990. It only looks back to 2005. It doesn't have us doing our fair share. We're not on track to meet it. And you've noted there's some double counting involved. You were disappointed in 2021, disappointed in 2024. I guess my question is that Environmental Defense has called out the elephant in the room is the subsidies to the oil and gas industry. Have you done any kind of value for money assessment of how those $18 billion plus funds could be redeployed to get us emission reductions over the coming years?
Unfortunately, I have to, again, limit
You can
to a
take
binary answer.
20 to 30 seconds of my time to answer.
We're still waiting. Okay, please keep it brief, Commissioner.
Okay, so we haven't done a recent report on fossil fuel subsidies, but we did do 2 reports on that issue before I was commissioner, and we testified on that issue a year or 2 ago as well. So the choice of how to use money, if it is to be redirected from those subsidies to somewhere else, is for the government. But yes, we've had concerns over the years with fossil fuel subsidies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to move a motion. Given that the Environment Commissioner reported that the government is not on track to meet their 2030
Ms. Collins,
emissions reduction
hold
target.
on a second. Just hold on a second. I'll get right back to you. Okay. Is this the motion regarding the net zero accelerator? No?
No.
Okay. Have you given 48 hours notice? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
The motion reads, given that the Environment Commissioner reported that the government is not on track to meet their 2030 emissions reduction targets, be the testimony heard by the committee from witnesses in the meetings that took place on November 20th, November 27th, and December 2nd, 2024, included concern with the government's emission reduction policies and progress. The committee report to the House of Commons its disappointment regarding the government's slow progress in meeting 2030 emissions reduction targets. And I won't speak too much to this. It's pretty straightforward and clear. I'm hoping that we can pass this very quickly, head to a vote without taking too much time out of the committee. Thanks.
Mr. Vancouver.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the motion, Ms. Collins. I appreciate all your work on this committee very much. I would like to discuss this. I would like to debate it. I think it warrants some conversation. But given that we have the commissioner here, and I know I would like to ask questions. I've got interest in this panel as well. I would just ask that we postpone debate on this until a date where we don't have witnesses here, so that we can complete this meeting before 1 o'clock. We all have things to do. So, Mr. Chair, I would ask that we adjourn debate for now and come back when we have more time and no witnesses.
Motion, so we'll vote and see what happens. Okay. Ms. Collins, you have your hand up. Is it a point of order?
I just put my hand up to be on the speaking list.
Okay. Okay. I'll put you on the speaking list. But right now we have to vote on Mr. Van Couverden's proposal that we adjourn debate on this, right? Yeah. Okay. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Ali?
Yes.
Madame Chatel? Mr. Longfield?
Yes.
Ms. Taylor-Roy? Mr. Van Couverden? Monsieur Datel?
No.
Mr. Krem? Mr. Leslie?
No.
Mr. Mazer?
No.
Monsieur Fortin?
Oui.
Ms. Collins?
No.
Six yeas, 5 nays.
Okay. So we'll go 5 minutes.
Very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. DeMarco, in your report on the Net Zero Accelerator, you noted that it did not effectively track emissions or emissions reductions. And this echoes what you said in Report 7. If you step back and look at the big picture of everything that you have audited in the department, have you come across significant evidence that the government is making adequate efforts to track emissions reductions in the initiatives that you have investigated?
So that's been a theme of our reports over many years, even before I started, that there needs to be more transparency in this area. Despite repeated recommendations, we're not at a level of transparency, monitoring and tracking, as you said, to the level that I think parliamentarians and Canadians are owed. So I would agree that there needs to be more transparency and better tracking so that, as I've indicated earlier, so that Canadians have confidence that the money being spent on this initiative, which is of critical importance for the current and future generations, is being done in a way that is obtaining results.
Okay, I would like to switch to Report 4 on page 10. I would like to read you a quote from this report. It says, "There are not enough international initiatives to encourage industries to decarbonize, such as definitions for near zero emissions goods or regulations requiring greener materials." Now, I found this statement quite interesting because we have heard at this committee in our report on climate financing that there were many international investors with great deals of money that are looking to invest in these decarbonization initiatives, and that Canada was even missing out on these investment opportunities. So I was wondering if you could explain, do you feel that there is an appetite among international investors to invest in green initiatives in Canada, or isn't there?
So certainly there's a trend towards greener investment and eventually to net zero and a carbon neutral future. But what we indicated in that report, and I apologize, I didn't bring my Net Zero Accelerator binder with me. I brought my Net Zero ACTA binder with me because we were here last week on the accelerator. But my recollection is that section of the report is especially focused on hard-to-abate industries that don't necessarily have enough of a price signal or available technologies currently to make a shift. And you know some of those sectors already in terms of steel and cement and so on. So existing measures have not been enough to shift those industries. There's an interest in it, there's a global appetite in it, but government levers are needed if that shift is in need of acceleration, as is the policy of Canada. So that's why they're using other measures such as subsidies to try to complement regulations and carbon pricing in order to get at these more hard-to-abate industries.
So would it be fair to say that there is global interest, just not enough global interest to invest in and of themselves? Is that fair?
Well, there's enough that there's a trend towards that, but is it happening fast enough and effectively enough to meet, for example, the the Paris Agreement 1.5 or 2 degree target. No, that's why we have things called accelerators that are meant to accelerate. But the idea is to make sure that they do, not just to have a name that it's accelerating.
Okay. Last week, we had Canada's climate change ambassador before the committee, and she claimed that economic growth had been decoupled from emissions reductions. In other words, we are not paying an economic price for a climate policy. Yet in Report 4, you've stated that heavy manufacturers and some of the biggest contributors to the economy aren't motivated to reduce emissions. Is that because it's just too expensive, or have we done all of the low-cost initiatives and everything remaining would be very costly to the economy? Is that accurate?
Yes, so on the first point, and we mentioned that in our lessons learned report in 2021, there has been some decoupling of emissions as against both population and production. So that's a good sign that it's not just in lockstep now, that for every additional unit of production you have an additional unit of equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's good. It means that there's getting to be some efficiencies. But it hasn't been enough, because especially in the oil and gas sector, efficiencies have been outweighed by increases in production.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. We'll end on that very good point. Mr. Van Koeverden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How long do I have? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. DeMarco, there's been a lot of debate here at this committee over the last couple of months, certainly, on whether Canada is on track with current climate action and emissions reduction strategies implemented so far. I'll be honest, I don't think it's super productive to debate whether, we're on track. Modeling has us at 34 or 35 or 36% when we all know that more ambition is necessary. We know that we need to do more, not less, to lower emissions and to fight climate change. I've expressed confidence and ambition because I think it's important to be positive, and I think it's really, really, productive, in fact, to talk about things that are working. I've been called a liar by some colleagues for stepping up and saying, you know what, I think we can do this, and I think it's possible, and I think we are on track with these and increased ambition. But I think much more important than arguing about whether it's 34, 35, or 36% is to talk about trajectory, because when things are going up, we can see they're going up. When things are going down, we can tell. Emissions are also unique because they have momentum and inertia, and they're not quickly reduced or eliminated. So my question is back to 2015. My understanding of Canada's overall emissions is that they were on their way up under the Harper government, and their goal of reducing their emissions by 30% below 2005 levels was clearly out of sight. Is that your take on the situation 8-9 years ago?
So yes, as indicated in our exhibit, for the early decades of Canada's fight against climate change, the graph was going in the wrong direction. And then since then, there's a relative plateau and then a little bit of a decrease in the last few years, around 7% since 2005. No doubt that if there had been no measures put in place by any government, the graph would have continued to go up because of increases in production and population in Canada. The exact amount is subject to different assumptions, but it's certainly true that the emissions would be way worse than now if there had been no measures at all.
No, you did mention population and production, but the size of our economy also contributes to that. Is that correct? Like, our economy was about it's 3 times larger now than it was in the 1990s. That is a large factor, is it not? I understand that wealthier countries have larger carbon footprints.
That's what I meant by production. The economic production had been going up and population had been going up.
Right. So we put in all of these measures, over 100 measures to reduce emissions. We've seen some progress, and the modeling shows that we are getting closer and closer to those goals of lowering our emissions. Then we enhanced that target, right? We made it from 30% to 40 to 45% to be more ambitious. But in that same period of time, we've seen Alberta Premier, Saskatchewan Premier, and Ontario Premier, 3 of the largest provinces in terms of their economy and their carbon outputs, kind of go in the wrong direction. And every time you've come, you've talked about the importance of collaboration and cooperation with other jurisdictions, because they have quite a large role to play as well. So I just would like to know if these actions taken by these provincial premiers will increase emissions or dampen those ambitions. So Alberta Premier Danielle Smith recently vowed to fight the cap on emissions. Will the cap on emissions help us reduce those emissions, or will they increase? And will fighting it, is that counter to climate action, or is it in line with it?
Well, I'm not going to insert myself in between the federal government and the Alberta government to try to adjudicate that debate. I'm no longer an environmental adjudicator, although sometimes I feel like it. But yeah, clearly we need to reduce emissions. The choice of measures is up to the government, and they need to have effective ones.
Okay. Perhaps I'll move on to a more qualitative approach. The Premier of Saskatchewan says, a lot of folks will come to me and say, hey, you guys have the highest carbon emissions per capita. I don't care. Is that type of approach going to help us lower our emissions, or is that the type of cooperation that we need to encourage?
Again, I'm not going to insert myself into parts of conversations between the provinces and the federal government, but we do have a graph in our lessons learned report about per capita emissions, and it is important to track that because Canada as a whole is quite a poor performer on per capita emissions.
Right. Well, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives was willing to insert themselves, and they said, if you want to understand why robust national climate policy is being blocked, just look to Saskatchewan. Since Doug Ford got elected, he's eliminated the Drive Clean program, which is a mandatory emissions test for passenger vehicles. He also just recently passed legislation so that Enbridge, a natural gas company, can lock in customers for decades to come, overriding Ontario's independent
thank you. We
energy
have to stop there,
regulator.
unfortunately. Yeah.
Now,
no, there's no time left for your 5 minutes is up. I'm sorry. Mr. Leslie for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And given those recent comments, I like to look, and I assume you do too, Commissioner, at outcomes, not aspirations, not targets, not goals. So, Commissioner, I'm going to ask you a pretty simple question based on a quote from that very parliamentary secretary, and I will quote the entirety of the sentence from Hansard. Today, thanks to the work of so many Canadians, including that member, we are ahead of our initial 2030 target and firmly on track to meet the targets set out in our 2030 emissions reduction plan. End quote. Is that a true or false statement?
That is the reason why I included the final paragraph in my opening statement today. So if I could give a fuller answer than just yes or no, I'll explain. I believe that different people are using on track in different ways, so I wanted to define how I'm using it, and the committee, it's up to the committee to whether you agree with my formulation, but by on track I mean 3 things. A plan with concrete measures that add up to meeting or exceeding the target, reliable modeling of the reductions that the plan is expected to deliver, and third, effective implementation of actions that results in significant year-over-year reductions. Until those 3 elements are seen, then I believe, in the way that I'm using on track, that the Government of Canada is not yet on track.
And I thank you for that. And I think back to a previous comment you made at this committee. You mentioned where Minister Guilbeault's department had privately admitted to you that additional measures would be needed to be implemented if they wanted to actually hit those emission targets. Now, when Minister Guilbeault was asked at a recent meeting whether or not he would raise the carbon tax above $170 a ton, he had said, quote, no decision has been made. So my question to you is, in your discussions with ECCC, perhaps even privately, do you know, and I was unavailable to ask the bureaucrats questions at the last meeting thanks to frivolous points of orders from members on the government side. Has ECCC ever done modeling above $170 a ton post-2030 in your awareness? So in the conversation you had with those officials, did they indicate what other measures might be on the table to actually help achieve those results?
Yes, so this is one of our concerns from our report this year. The third part of our report under the Net Zero Act looks at the progress report, the first one that Environment and Climate Change has issued. And they're required, when there is a gap between the plan and the expected results, they're required to put in potential additional measures in the report. And in the back of that report, the progress report, they do list some additional measures, but they're very vague. We will explore, that sort of wording, and I don't want to quote them directly because you can look at it, but there's a need for concrete additional measures, not just vague assertions of possible future measures in order to bridge that gap.
would it be reasonable to expect that they could want to continue to either accelerate beyond 2030 or hasten the pace of the rising carbon tax, as well as the minister has recently discussed the fact that he is, quote, very supportive of discussions to create a new global carbon tax on international shipping. Now, given those ongoing discussions, do you suspect that either one of those options might be what the government is looking at in terms of additional tools to try to reach their failing targets?
I don't believe that the progress report had any additional measures relating to carbon pricing at the end of it, if I recall correctly. I don't have that with me, but no, I don't think there were any additional measures listed that would be in the carbon pricing category.
So would it be reasonable to think the government is looking at that as a known tool that they already have in their toolbox?
Yeah, it would be reasonable to ask them that, but not me.
I would love to next time. Now, let me move on to, broadly speaking, some international conversations regarding transferring of money to less developed nations to combat or to deal with adaptation of climate change. Do you have any sense of what the government of Canada currently sends through any department to countries around the world, to various other governments for climate-related programs in terms of a dollar value? And secondarily to that, have you ever considered doing a value for money audit on the tax dollars that are flowing to other countries to help combat climate change there?
So Auditor General Hogan recently released a report on international assistance. It wasn't specific to climate change, though. So that would be our office's most recent analysis of Canada's international aid efforts in general. We haven't done an audit specifically, like a deep dive into the international climate finance side of things. No, we haven't. No.
Is that something you would consider doing? I think there's obviously pretty large dollar values associated with this. I think it would be reasonable to find out, A, where the money's going, what it's going towards, and B, whether or not Canadian taxpayers are getting value for that money.
I need a yes or no answer to that. If you're not required to give a yes or no answer, but that's
Development topic could be considered. We'd have to look at it according to our lens in terms of whether it's an efficient use of our resources to look at it.
Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner and staff, for being here for even more discussions, which I think are entirely appropriate for our committee. Commissioner, in some of the recent discussions at committee, we talked about the implementation of the emissions cap. We also talked about the lack of sign-in by some of the larger emitters in Canada, and maybe some of the things that are delaying that, either at the board level or technically or production levels. I'm trying to piece together your 10 reports. I think what would be really helpful is something like what the CCI, the Canadian Climate Institute, puts out to say 440 megaton goal. Here are government policies that each one is contributing part of towards that goal. So I'm thinking, you mentioned in this morning's meeting how important pricing pollution is in terms of reaching our goal. That's one of our key policy planks. And, you know, it's been said the Conservatives have made it very, very clear that they would get rid of that. And what that impact would have in us meeting our goals is a question I would have back to you on let's say, a summary audit. We also have the Clean Fuel Standard. We have the Net Zero Accelerator we've mentioned this morning, capital cost allowance for clean technology adoption, transportation progress on EV and others. The emissions cap we've mentioned this morning, and the number is about 11 megatons of the 440, 11 to 15 megatons. Is it something that you could consider pulling together the 10 reports to say, yes, we're not on track overall. High risk in this area if you eliminated price on pollution. We also know price on pollution is going up. And even in the last question by Mr. Leslie, we do have goals to increase by 2030. Beyond 2030, there will be more goals that we'll work on internationally. Could you comment on how can we pull this together in terms of an audit that would come back to us as parliamentarians to know where the key risks are?
So
it was a long question.
A lot there. So as I mentioned earlier, we've looked at, there's over 140 measures in Canada. Some of them have either no emissions reductions associated with them or very small emissions reductions. So we've looked at about 40 so far, 20 this year, and 20 in other audits, I believe.
Yeah,
And
I'm in a meeting right now.
we summarize that, the recent ones in Appendix A of this year's report, and then the newer ones that we looked at are in the body of this report. Should we look at all of them every year? I'm not sure that would be the best use of resources because many of these measures are of marginal importance from a GHG reduction point of view. They're quite valuable from a capacity building point of view or an enabling point of view. So as I indicated earlier, if there were a plan that added up to at least 40%, I would be more inclined to consider, doing a deconstruction and analysis of it to see whether it really adds up. But right now, as we're in 2021, we still have a plan that doesn't add up to 40 to 45%. And I'm disinclined to go through every line of every measure when we already know that it's something at 36 or lower. I don't know if it's a good use of time.
The vagueness of saying that we're not on track is what is bothering me. And it's not politically motivated, although there is politics involved if we remove the price on pollution, which is one of our signature policies that should be reducing 30% of overall emissions and is an escalating factor, which means it will have more effect as time goes on. But things like the clean fuel standard that's being brought, that it's going through regulations, could be applied to some of our major emitters in the transport industry. I don't get a sense that you've looked at that in terms of what the context is. It's putting into context what your individual 10 reports are.
Well, the context piece is our lessons learned report from 2021, where we tried to bring everything together, and we have an appendix with all of our reports listed in there. And then with this year's Net Zero Act report, we have an appendix that tracks recommendations that we've made, sort of a continuous reporting approach. So I think we are doing an element of what you're asking. As to the controversy over whether Canada is on track or not, that was why I just a few minutes ago defined how I'm using the term. And
Right.
there's complete agreement with the department that they are not on track according to the definition that I'm using.
Thank you. Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Fortin, thank you, Chair. Mr. DeMarco, you're aware of the zero emissions plan that was established by the government for transportation. $275 million will be used to advance Canada's efforts in buying public transit and school buses, along with the Infrastructure Bank of Canada. Now, there are many details in this program. We don't have time to go into all of them, but recently we've noted that there is a major problem with Lyon Electric, whose headquarters are in my riding, and that is building zero-emission school buses. And they've invested, and they're prepared to deliver thousands of school buses. And because at the time, that was what was going to be required. And under the program, 50% of the acquisition costs would be covered. But Lyon now has a major problem, and that is that the buyers, the clients, the operators of this school bus system are not able to purchase the school buses because the federal government, according to what I've read, according to one of the responses I received, the school board was limited to something like 25 to 30% of the cost being covered, and that's insufficient. And so because they're not able to make their operations profitable with such a weak subsidy, they're still buying diesel-operated buses. So my question is this. Is the federal government doing the right thing by restricting its investments and leaving it up to school bus operators to buy diesel-fired buses instead of these new buses? Or should the federal government respect the commitments that it took and go ahead with that 50% of funding for acquisition costs? I'd like to know what your opinion is. Well, I can answer briefly. I'm not an expert when it comes to the details between Lyon and the government and the businesses who are acquiring. Yes, but I'm talking about the program itself. Was this one of the programs that we looked at? We looked at the Bank of Infrastructure. It's one of the Bank of Infrastructure programs, but we didn't look at the details of the contracts. Thank you. Ms. Collins, you have the floor. I'm sorry, but wasn't this a 6-minute round? No, I'm sorry. It's still 2.5 minutes each. Right up until the end of the meeting? Well, in terms of the NDP and the Bloc, yes. We don't just start again with the 6 minutes on another round. If there had been a second panel, yes, we would have done that, but we're still on the same witness. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to the Commissioner. I just wanted to go back to the emissions cap, and this feels like one of the key policies that needs to be strengthened, and that we need more stringency. When it comes to the implementation of this policy, the implementation, we're going to be waiting until 2030 for the first kind of phase. Can you talk a little bit about the danger of pushing back this kind of implementation, the urgency and the need to have stringency on this policy?
Implementation is a theme from this year's report and last year's report, as well as our greenhouse gas regulations audit from last year. So when you have a target like 2030 or an interim objective like 2026, it's important that the measure is crystallized sufficiently by the date so that you actually are getting the emissions reductions, as opposed to they're just going to happen at some point in the future. So the problem with delays is that because these regulations are typically phased in and there's a compliance period and so on, that if they're pushed off too far, then they might have little effect on 2030, and they'll only realize their benefits after 2030. We had the same conclusion with our 2 billion trees report, that it wasn't really much of a measure to assist with 2030 because it was going to really only reap rewards in the decades that follow. So the timely design and implementation of measures is important because there's not much time left between now and 2030, and any measure takes time to bear fruit. It's not like flipping a switch. There's phase-in provisions and regulations, for example, transition provisions, compliance periods, and so on. So the slower that each of these measures gets put into place, the more at risk the 2030 target is.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, do I have any time left?
30 seconds.
Okay, great. Mr. DeMarco, we'll probably only get to this in the next round, but I wanted to ask you about carbon budgets. And I know in not your last visit here, but the visit before, my colleague Taylor Bacharach had been discussing carbon budgets with you. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how this could be an effective emissions reduction policy, as the UK has done, and any other kind of lessons learned from the UK when it comes to what we could be doing here in Canada. So
yeah,
I'll kind of re-ask it at the next.
I don't know if the Commissioner wants to produce something in writing. That'll be up to Ms. Collins to ask for if that's what she wants. But is that what you want?
I would love that, or if we have another chance in this meeting,
well, you'll have
I'll
another
try
chance.
and get it in.
So maybe you can leave a couple of minutes to the Commissioner when it's your turn next. Mr. Mazier.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, the government ripped out over 360 pages from their $8 billion net zero accelerator fund and from the contracts. So they ripped out 360 pages. Did the government remove any pages from the contracts before you read them? Yes or no?
My recollection from my colleague, Mr. Blouin, last week is that he indicated that we had full access to those documents. I didn't read each of them, all the pages myself, but the team reviewed them, yes.
So there were no pages ripped out when the team reviewed them?
My recollection, but I don't have that team with me here today, but I believe he answered something similar to that last week on Monday.
Thank you.
Or whatever day we were here last week. We've been here quite a few times.
Yes, we meet Mondays and Wednesdays, so it is.
It was either a Monday or a Wednesday then.
Commissioner, do you believe Canadians are getting good value for money from the government's $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund?
Our view is that they haven't demonstrated that they're providing value for money. It's possible that good value for money will be obtained, but we would like it to be shown in advance in a transparent way that that's happening, as opposed to just hoping that it will happen.
Were there some projects, did you have any examples in the reports that were, some projects showed like the value for money was like beyond $160 a ton?
So we did two calculations, and again, I don't have that binder with me, so.
Were there any
We
numbers
looked at 5 that had commitments in the contribution agreement, and it was a little less than $200 in terms of the cost per ton. And then if you divided it by 17, then it was over 500, if I recall correctly.
$100 a ton?
If across all 17, if you did the calculation that way.
Okay.
So,
Well,
so
that's good.
we
I have
do
more
have
questions
concerns
here.
about that, yes.
Okay. Has the current government ever misled Canadians about their emissions reduction data or projections? Yes or no?
Misled in a sort of a intentional way, or misled in?
Well, if they did, how did they mislead?
Well, we've had examples of inaccurate projections in various audits, but whether there was a mental state of mind, if the government can have one, in terms of they're trying to mislead, I don't know. But I only look at whether the projections are being met, and if not, whether the projections are reliable, and if so, whether they're being met. I haven't really looked at the intention behind the statements associated with the projections.
Or inaccuracies?
Yeah, so there's definitely been inaccuracies.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that the current government is double counting their emissions reductions and therefore misleading Canadians?
So this has come up in several of our recent reports, that the siloed approach and the lack of centralization on the climate file can lead to double counting, and it could be innocuous double counting that one department doesn't know that it's also being covered by another. So there has been examples of double counting. The most, I guess, the earliest example we had was from the Emissions Reduction Fund, where a subsidy to the oil and gas industry was not designed in a way that would necessarily be additional to what was going to be achieved through regulation anyway. And so there was a potential for double counting from the subsidy program and the regulation. There have been other examples as well.
Commissioner, I'm going to quote the Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment Minister. Earlier this year, he stated in the House of Commons, and I quote, "We are ahead of our initial 2030 target and firmly on track to meet the targets set out in our 2030 emissions reduction plan." End quote. Is this statement true or accurate? Yes or no?
So as I indicated earlier, the words "on track" can be used in different ways in different contexts. That's why I define the way I'm using it. So I would say the government is not on track according to the 3 criteria that I mentioned a few minutes ago.
And I know before you had a graph up, and the Parliamentary Secretary actually referred to a motion, like once you get the wave started, it'll go kind of thing. But then you had the same graph up here. At the very end of it, it's actually headed on the way back up again. So this government actually, throughout all their increases in the carbon tax and everything else, and all these $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund and all this stuff, it's going up. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I said, in terms of the third element of on-trackness, if there's such a word, is there needs to be an effective implementation of actions resulting in significant year-over-year reductions. So we're not seeing that post-COVID. We are seeing it bounce back up a little bit. The good thing is it's not bounced back up all the way, so that's good news if you want to look at it as the glass half full. But we do need a very steep drop to get down to our future targets. And if you extrapolate the graph so far, you're still going to need a much steeper drop than what we're seeing recently.
Thank you. Mr. Ali.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for being in the committee. Commissioner, can you speak to the importance of the pollution cap when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas sector? And do you believe that government is achieving the right balance when it comes to incentivizing emissions reductions and requiring them through regulations?
So, as I indicated earlier, the oil and gas sector is the largest emitter in Canada, and measures are needed to bend that curve. We know that it's possible to increase production and decrease emissions over time in another sector, the electricity sector, and we've seen good results there. So I agree that measures are needed to bring the curve down on oil and gas. The choice of measures is up to the government in terms of which measures it will use to do that. But it is necessary to bring down that sector's emissions, its total emissions, if we're going to have any hope of meeting the 2030 target.
Thank you. In your opening statement, you indicated that the time of our 2021 report, you noted that implementing the measures then in a place was expected to yield reductions of 36% by 2030. What has changed since then for both the negative and positive?
Yes, so in 2021, we indicated that taken together, full implementation of the actions and measures are expected to yield reductions of 36% below 2005 levels by 2030. And we also noted that that the emphasis this time should be on meeting the targets and not just making plans. Sound plans are essential, but it is the outcome that really matters, which has been a theme of many of my comments today and in previous. So what's changed? Unfortunately, the 36% hasn't changed, although it actually has. There have been different estimations between now and then. It's gone down to 34.6 and back up to 36%. But the gap remains, and that's unfortunate. Some new measures have been brought into place, or at least are planned to be brought into place, such as the oil and gas emissions cap, electricity regulations, the finalization of the clean fuel regulations. But none of the ones that are in place are enough to fully fill that 4% gap. And my understanding of that the oil emissions cap, at least in the narrative that was associated with the draft regulation that was published, it on its own isn't enough to fill the 4% gap, but it would contribute to filling that gap.
Thank you. And since 2019, when most of our emissions reduction policies began to take effect, we have made significant progress in reducing Canada's emissions. This actually shows the difference that can be made when government takes serious action to reduce emissions. When we look at the comparable G7 nations over that time frame since 2019, can you confirm that Canada's emissions have actually declined faster than some other G7 peers, including Japan, the United States, and Italy?
Yes, so we use the two baselines in our exhibit in this year's report and last year's report of 1990 and 2005, 1990 being the baseline year for the UN Convention and 2005 being the baseline year for Canada's current NDC for the 2030 target. But if you look at more recent data, essentially if you put in another graph here for just the last few years, you will see a drop in Canada, and it's not as bad relative to the other G7 countries as it is if you look at these two baseline years. But that's partly not that surprising because many of those countries made deep reductions already, so they're now at the point where it's difficult to do further reductions. Canada didn't do any reductions since 1990. Its emissions are up, so it still has the ability to bring it down, more of an ability to bring it down in absolute terms than some of those other countries. But I would have to look at the various factors involved to see exactly why there's been changes. But the long and the short of it is we're only down by around 7 or 8% since the 2005 level. We've got to get to 40% to 45% in just 6 years. So there's a long way to go.
Merci. Alors, on entre dans notre dernier.
Thank you. We are now at our last round, and Mr. Deltel, you will kick off. Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome again, Mr. DeMarco. Now, obviously, this Net Zero Accelerator initiative is a huge investment, and there has not been much in the way of results. Do you think Canadians are getting their money's worth? Are Canadians getting their money's worth? That's just an expression.
Appreciate the value.
Are we getting value for money? Is Canada getting value for money?
Yeah. So,
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that my sound wasn't working. As I said earlier, the department has not shown to Canadians that there is value for money at this point. Perhaps there will be at some point, but transparency is required to be able to see whether there is a value for money, because that is a significant amount of money for taxpayers. Well, please, first, allow me to say that your French is excellent. And I'd like to thank you for all your work and the work of the interpreters, because this is not an easy job. I'm sorry, I've been listening to the floor. I actually haven't been listening to the interpretation, but I wasn't able to hear when you put your question to me. No problem. Now, under the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, there is very little transparency. There isn't enough accountability. Targets haven't been met or established. And so what that means is that it undermines credibility when it comes to the Canadians. And there's another issue. It's also not ethical. There is another fund that is used to combat climate change, and this is the Green Sustainable Fund. Now, another committee has been looking at this. The Auditor General has been looking at this, and out of $500 million, $310 million have not been allocated ethically. So that means that funds were basically voted for themselves in certain areas, and about $4 out of $5 was not spent according to the was not allocated ethically. And when you're talking about that amount of money, taxpayers' money, do you feel that in the same way that the Net Zero Fund has been used, what this means when there is very little transparency is that then you lose the trust? So does the misuse also of the Sustainable Development Fund also undermine credibility and undermine efforts to combat climate change? Well, based on there's a difference between both the funds, and we've looked at them separately, but obviously there are concerns. And in our report, the report on the Net Zero Accountability Fund, the concerns were not the same that were raised in the other. But they were significant in terms of value for money, the lack of a horizontal policy, and the lack of a guarantee in many agreements of achieving specific targets. So there are concerns with respect to both, and this raises issues, obviously, for Canadians and parliamentarians. I didn't have a timer in my head, so I wasn't sure how much time I had. I'm going to raise a question that I raised a while ago. As Canadians, we're all aware that emissions have to be reduced and everybody has to do their part. Now, when you have a neighbor beside you, not a small neighbor, the United States, a huge emitter of emissions, how can we make sure that our efforts in Canada to reduce emissions are not really drowned out by what's happening south of the border? As you know, the auto industry produces significant amount of emissions, and the other side of the border is right here. So might Canada be suffering from pollutions from other countries, including the United States? That's quite an extensive issue. I'm not sure if you have time to answer, but go ahead. Well, it is possible that another country or other countries are not doing their part in reductions, and that's all I can say for now.
Thank you again, Mr. Mark, for your comments. I just want to carry on from the line of questioning Mr. Deltel had. Would you say that other countries not doing their part to meet emissions targets is a reason Canada shouldn't be doing theirs?
Yeah, so what I was about to speak to was collective action problems. So you're probably familiar with the term tragedy of the commons. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, I believe, in terms of human society not necessarily looking after the commons properly and the incentives there are to destroy the commons in individual actions that add up to collective destruction of the commons. So that's true of a lot of things. That Canada is not big enough to be a large player in just about anything. If you look at the fact that there are about 200 countries in the world, we do have a special responsibility with respect to water, forests, and several things where we have a large share. But yes, we're all in this together. It's a whole of planet problem, and there is the potential for certain countries to choose to adopt what's called a free rider approach to the detriment of others. And if too many of them adopt a free rider approach, then we will unfortunately not meet our Paris targets, and we will have a tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sure no one wants Canada to be a free rider. That's certainly not our reputation internationally. I know we've always done our part to try and address international crises and to make sure that we maintain peace globally, and I think this is an important part of that. So thank you for that. It's also, it's just not south of the border, right? It's globally. It doesn't matter if it's the United States or whether it's the UK or Germany. Emissions are emissions, and they're going to affect climate change globally. So this is irrelevant in terms of who is doing it. And I was just wondering, we've heard a lot of concern about the government not reaching its targets right now, but we do know, and you've mentioned it, that the analysis that was done, I think, by Navius, and there's been other people who have also done estimates that right now the climate policies will prevent 226 megatons of carbon pollution, and that's roughly equal to the total annual emissions of Ontario and Quebec. But that says that without the programs we have in place, not just government, but provincial programs as well, and even municipal, that our emissions would be more than 40% higher in 2050 than they're currently on track to be. So we have a huge gap there that, even if we haven't met them, we've put in place more aggressive targets for 2030 when we saw we were on track to meet the 35%. But this is still making a huge difference. These policies are in place. But as the opposition rightly points out, they're very concerned that it's not enough, that we have to do more to fight climate change. So what would if you were to look at this and say, okay, what could Canada do that would really make a difference right now in terms of meeting these targets or even more ambitious targets? What would you say? I mean, you've studied all these programs, you've looked at all of these policies. What could we do on a large scale that would really make a big difference?
Yes, so I look at that from two perspectives. What should we do in sort of a thematic sense? And those are the 8 lessons learned from the report. But we can also look at it from a sector point of view. What do we need to do to prioritize? And surely oil and gas and transportation, given how large of a chunk of the pie they occupy in Canada, we need to, if we're going to meet the targets, we need to address those. And by comparing sectors to others, so say for oil and gas to electricity, as I've done today, or by comparing Canada to other G7 countries that have some similarities, it shows that it can be done. So I don't want to be taken as being entirely negative about this. I still believe we could meet the 2030 target, but what would need to be done would be to bring down that oil and gas curve, and also to make progress in all of the other sectors, especially transportation and buildings. But it's become such a race now from 2024 to 2030. We're going to need help in all the sectors, but those ones would be the ones that I would say need to be targeted most significantly if we're going to have any chance to meet 2030.
So to address the concerns of the opposition, you're saying oil and gas really has to bring down their emissions somehow, whether it's through capping production, the provinces can do that, obviously that's not our jurisdiction, or bringing down emissions. So the cap on pollution from the oil and gas sector, whether it's exactly the right policy or not, but that's the right direction. We have to bring down emissions from the oil and gas sector, obviously, to get there. And transportation.
Yeah, we're out of, maybe the commissioner could answer that question with a yes or no or something similar, and then we can go on to Mr. Fortin. I mean, do we need to bring down the emissions? I guess that's the question. Do we need to bring down the emissions from the gas?
This is not just me saying it, because as I indicated, I'm not a policy advisor. There are other bodies for that. But the government's own plan relies on all sectors contributing.
Okay, thanks. Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Dimarco.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. DeMarco, we know that greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced by 7.1% in 2022 since 2005. We also know that the target for 2030 is 40%. So there's a huge gap, about a 33% gap. And when I think of that, I think, perhaps naively, that it's almost impossible to achieve. Now, earlier on, you spoke about this 36%. Am I to understand that the 36% is what we will achieve in 2030 if the government does meet the targets that it set in implementing the various measures and programs? Is that what I am to understand from what you said about the 36%? Yes, well, there are two gaps. There is the one between 7% and 40%. That's the result, basically. So that's the difference. That's a difference that you have to look at. And 2022 is the most recent one, and you can see between 2022 and 2030, another 33% is required. But under the plan, they're only going to achieve 36%. So there's a difference in the plan, there's a difference in the results being targeted. I believe that it's a bit optimistic. And so what they need to do is improve their plan to get to 36 or 40%. So they need to make up that difference. Well, is it realistic to think that we'll be able to do that? Well, it is possible to do it in 6 years if there's a will to do it, yes? How? Well, with all those measures in place and additional measures to get that gap down to zero. So earlier on, I raised the issue of subsidies for the green shift in, for example, public transit and school buses. So do you think the grants, for example, to the subsidies to the oil and gas sector should be abandoned as a way of getting to our targets? What do you think about both of those? Perhaps he could answer yes or no, Chair? Yes or no, or nothing? Well, I'm afraid it's a little more complex than that. You don't have to answer. I think, in fact, it probably has been answered. Of course, yes, we could invest and money in one place could be used in another place, I'm assuming. Well, there are two sorts of subsidies. There are subsidies that assist in reaching these targets. For example, the Net Zero Accountability Fund. There are also subsidies that are not actually consistent with reaching our targets. And that is what you were probably referring to when we were talking about subsidies to the oil and gas sector. Thank you, Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to go back to the question around carbon budgets. So establishing carbon budgets is something that I pushed for when we were initially amending the Net Zero Accountability Act. This is also a recommendation from the Net Zero Advisory Body. I'm just wondering if, Commissioner, you can comment on how it might be beneficial if Canada were to adopt carbon budgeting.
Yes, thank you for the question, and you did get a chance to come back to it. And in the meantime, it allowed Ms. Leach to find the paragraph from last year's report about carbon budgeting. So I'll turn it over to Principal Leach to address that question, Ms. Collins.
Great. Thanks very much. Yes, in our report from last year under the Net Zero Act, the 2023 audit, we talked about carbon budgeting as an effective tool for avoiding a slip in ambition and for course correction. And as we know, carbon budgets allow, a fixed total amount of greenhouse gas emissions allowed over a period of time. And in the UK, that is they have legislated 5-year carbon budgets. And that is a tool that they use for accountability, and they have been successful in setting and meeting their carbon budgets.
And this is something that when we were amending the Net Zero Accountability Act, I pushed for, and I was really disappointed that the government was not willing to adopt carbon budgeting here in Canada, and we've seen the consequences of that. I'm curious when it comes to other policies that the UK has implemented that we could maybe have lessons learned from. Have you looked at all about country comparisons about what has been effective in other jurisdictions like the UK who have bent that curve and have reduced their emissions more than Canada?
Yes, so when we see the huge difference in performance between Canada and the UK, it would obviously lead to the question about what are they doing that we aren't doing. They're not exactly the same situation as Canada, but there are some similarities. And so we did use some examples, not only carbon budgeting, but also some other examples in the lessons learned report. And Ms. Leach probably has those at the tip of her tongue as well.
Just the fact that they have the UK Climate Change Committee has been an enormous accountability factor there. But yes, we have looked at other countries as well in our lessons learned document, including Norway and Denmark and some of the other countries.
So it's all in the lessons learned document, basically. Is that what is it in the lessons learned?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
For both of those countries.
Thank you. Mr. Cram.
Mr. DeMarco, I'd like to follow up with my questions from the previous round. So, given that how far behind Canada is in meeting our emissions reductions targets, and the yet to be announced new initiatives that would have to happen in order to meet that goal, is it safe to say that any plan or any initiatives to meet our climate change goals would come with significant economic cost? Is that a safe assumption?
They have, there's a difference between financial costs and economic costs. So financial cost is essentially actual outlays of money that people, economic costs can factor in externalities and the costs of doing nothing and so on. So and I'm talking about collective action problems, so it's not just what Canada does. But if Canada and other countries step up and do their part and avert catastrophic climate change, then the economic costs would be positive to doing that, in the sense that a much hotter planet will have all sorts of other negative economic costs associated with it, which the insurance companies are dealing with already. So there is a financial cost to most measures, but the question of an economic cost brings in more factors such as externalities, and the whole reason that all of the countries of the United Nations are trying to work on this is that they feel that the economic, health, and environmental costs of not combating climate change are worse than combating climate change.
Now, in your lessons learned or lessons that you've attached to your prepared statement, in lesson 3, you say that adaptation must be prioritized to protect against the worst effects of climate change. I'm interested in your choice of word, prioritized. Are you saying that our adaptation efforts should be a priority over our climate mitigation efforts?
No, one can have more than one priority. So mitigation and adaptation are both important, but relative to mitigation, as of the date of our report of 2021, adaptation had been given undue, or had not been given enough attention in Canada, so it needed to essentially get more attention, and that's why Ms. Leach, her team is actually doing an audit on Canada's adaptation strategy right now for submission to this committee next year. So we're prioritizing it by doing a specific audit on it, and frankly, since 2021, there at least now is a national adaptation strategy. But what year did we recommend that there be one?
2006.
2006, our office recommended that there should be a national adaptation strategy, and we just recently got it in the last few years.
Okay, well, I look forward to reading it when it comes to this committee. In your remarks, you noted that transparency has been an ongoing problem with the government's climate change initiatives, in particular with the Net Zero Accelerator Fund. Now, when you had and your team had the opportunity to review the unredacted contracts, but parliamentarians did not. In the course of your review of those contracts, did you see any real reason why so much of those contracts had to be redacted for parliamentarians?
Oh, as I indicated quite quickly at the end of the previous round, I don't have the version you have, so I don't know what the pages are that were redacted. I just know that there were some redacted, but I don't know which pages.
Okay, fair enough. And in my time remaining, I would like to give my time to Mr. Leslie.
Thank you. I'd just like to follow up on a previous report on the Liberals' 2 billion tree plan, where they were accused of double counting and we're still something like 1.8 billion trees short. So I'm curious if that Liberal promise is any closer to being achieved. And secondly, as it relates to forests, I'm sure you followed our investigation into the devastating Jasper wildfire this summer. And obviously it came to light that poor forestry management practices, particularly through Parks Canada, were devastating in consequence. So I'm curious if you've ever thought about doing a study towards the emission release, which is obviously extensive from forest fires, as it relates to government failures in forestry management, particularly the federal government and Parks Canada.
So I understand that you've had several hearing dates about that, and coincidentally, the cover of our report of the Net Zero Act, that is Jasper National Park with the burnt trees on Report 7. But we haven't done a report on that subject or an audit on that subject specifically. We have reported on the problems associated with Canada's accounting system for forestry and in the larger category of land use change, and forestry, as the second part of our 2 billion trees report from a couple of years ago. But we haven't done an audit specifically on the efficacy of forest management approaches to limiting the scale of destruction associated with these increased intense and frequent forest fires.
Alors, on termine par Madame Châtel.
We're now going to finish with Ms. Châtel. You're saying it will be then Mr. Van Couverden? Go ahead, Mr. Van Couverden.
You've come to this committee like probably a dozen times since I've been here, so I just want to thank you for being so available to the committee, but also for your exceptional work. Canada's really, really fortunate that we have an environment commissioner. Not every country does. I believe in accountable and transparent government. I believe in making sure that our ambitions and our goals are measurable and measured. And for my part, I really appreciate your work. But beyond that, I'm also very appreciative that we have somebody who believes in climate action, somebody who believes in science, somebody who comes here to genuinely, I believe that you're doing your work so that our country plays a stronger, more ambitious role in reducing our emissions, fighting climate change, and preserving our natural environment. And maybe in a future role or life, we'll find each other holding placards up with some kind of a protest. I personally like. There's no Planet B. I don't know. I think I can imagine you similarly caring enough about our environment to show up on one of those opportunities. I had the opportunity to look through the agenda of this committee between 2011 and 2015, when Harper had a conservative majority in Canada. They didn't talk much about climate change. they actually didn't address it once. And obviously, when you have a conservative government, you control the agenda at committee. The environment was an issue then, and so was climate change. But I looked at the final report that the commissioner gave, a previous commissioner, of course, in 2015. And what he said is that we observed the federal government did not have a plan for how it will work towards the greater reductions required beyond 2020. And it was not coordinating with provinces, and it was not setting goals commensurate with a reduction in emissions. I mentioned some provincial stuff earlier, and I know that you're reticent to comment on extra-jurisdictional actions. But one of the things that really concerned me in 2018 when Doug Ford got elected as Premier in Ontario, in my home province, he'll take a lot of credit for things that previous governments did with respect to the phase-out of coal and the reductions in emissions that led to. But he immediately axed the position of Commissioner of the Environment in Ontario. He also repealed a bunch of environmentally focused legislation and has really not demonstrated a sincere commitment to fighting climate change or lowering emissions in Ontario. In fact, he spent $3 billion of taxpayer money buying gas plants for electricity generation. I worry that a future Conservative government may not respect your role to the same degree that our government has. And I worry that a future Poilievre-led government, given what the oil and gas sector has said with respect to Pierre Poilievre and Andrew Scheer, is the best thing that could ever happen for the oil and gas sector. They won't be held accountable. So my question to you is maybe a little bit more personal. Are you fearful about the work that you are able to do and that you do so well here in Canada to continue if a government doesn't demonstrate leadership and ambition with respect to lowering our emissions, and if they don't value accountability to the same degree that our government has? Are you fearful that a future Conservative government, like Doug Ford has already done, could eliminate the position of the Commissioner of the Environment in Canada?
So an Auditor General office, and there's one in almost every country, tends to stick around through feast or famine. It's an important accountability function that governments around the world have implemented. I don't have a concern that our office would be hamstrung in the future from highlighting problems in the performance of government, whether it's on the financial side or on our performance audit work. We're here to, without fear or favor, to provide the evidence that we found and to provide recommendations for improvement. Sometimes the truth can hurt politically, but our role is to provide that information to you as parliamentarians so you can hold government to account. I'm fearful about the potential for catastrophic climate change and biodiversity loss, but I'm not going to be commenting on, any fear. I haven't really turned my mind to any fear about my position or whatever. And to be honest, the scale of the problem globally and nationally is what I'm worried about, not my own role.
Thank you. That's pretty much it.
Can I ask one short follow-up?
You have 15 seconds for a statement.
Can I just ask that if, as a Canadian and as a self-described environmentalist, you're concerned about the direction the planet is headed in general?
Yes, I mean, for the rest of my lifetime, because of the residency time of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, things are going to get worse on climate, and things are bound to get worse on biodiversity.
Thank you.
But we have the opportunity to lessen the damage and to do our best for future generations, and that's what I hope.
Commissioner, always a pleasure to see you. And we thank you for your insights and the analysis that you and Ms. Leach and Ms. DaCosta do, and we look forward to seeing you again in the not-too-distant future, I'm sure. Thank you again, and have a good day. Thank you, members, for your questions.